In this chapter, we will be talking about schizophrenia and several other psychotic disorders. Schizophrenia is a psychotic disorder. Psychosis involves severe disturbance in language and thought, often sensation and perception as well. There can be motor disturbance, there's usually emotional disturbance, and often people who are psychotic find it very hard to behave appropriately in social situations. We're going to be talking a lot about the schizophrenic spectrum because it's clear from research that genes contribute to risk for schizophrenia, but that most of the people who have these genes do not have the severe symptoms of schizophrenia. Instead, they have a personality disorder, which we've already talked about, called schizotypal personality disorder. We'll mention several of the other psychotic disorders and give you a little background, and we'll talk a bit about cause and treatment in this disorder as well, in this chapter as well. This is a very famous painting, and I doubt you can see the details of it from this slide alone, but you can get online a version of it that allows you to blow up every part and see it. The painting was done by William Kurelik, who's a very famous artist who has his work in almost every major museum in the world. Very prolific, but also suffered from schizophrenia. But unlike most people who suffer from schizophrenia, who often fail to function at a very high level for their entire life, William Kurelik got married, had children, raised a family, and was very productive for a very long period of time, despite all of the experiences that he had when he was younger and quite psychotic, and despite the fact that he was still suffering from many of the residual symptoms associated with schizophrenia. Let me give you just a brief history. We talked about this before, so this is mostly a reminder. First of all, schizophrenia does not mean split personality, what we used to call multiple personality disorder, now called dissociative identity disorder. The person who coined the term schizophrenia, Eugene Bleuler, thought it was a split of thought and emotion. The original term for schizophrenia was actually dementia praecox. Alzheimer's is a form of dementia. Praecox means early. So what we're talking about is an early dementia that comes on in late teens or the 20s and continues throughout life. Kraepelin's descriptions were exceedingly vivid. If you were to read them today, 140 years after he wrote them, and go into a psychiatric hospital, you'd be struck by how spot on they are. He believed that schizophrenia was a brain disorder, although in the 1880s he had no way of proving that. We now know that it clearly is a brain disorder, although it is not just a brain disorder. Bleuler coined the term schizophrenia, and you may remember that he also coined the term schizoid, which was one of our personality disorders. He did that in 1911, and he changed the criteria proposed for dementia praecox by Kraepelin. Unfortunately, Bleuler was wrong, and Kraepelin was right. Bleuler, in broadening the criteria for schizophrenia, actually created a diagnosis that had two diagnoses embedded in it. Schizophrenia, or what we now call schizophrenia, what Kraepelin called dementia praecox, and a disorder that we now call bipolar disorder. Many people have argued that schizophrenia has been around for a long time, and because it clearly has a genetic contribution, one would expect that the genes would be dropping off in frequency simply because the majority of people with the disorder do not have children and therefore do not pass on their genes. The truth is, unlike almost every major disorder that we talk about in this course, there are no unambiguous descriptions of schizophrenia going back more than about 300 years. Now that's surprising because schizophrenia is a fascinating disorder. The symptoms are unusual and certainly would have captured the attention of people. Now, we don't know why that is. There's speculation, and we'll talk about that later. But it's an interesting observation that is important in our understanding of the disorder. If you've never seen the movie A Beautiful Life, I encourage you to see it. It's a great movie, very well done. The acting was just simply amazing. It's the story of John Nash, who was a brilliant mathematician and helped us win World War II by breaking codes from the Nazis. But he also suffered from schizophrenia. And even during the war, when he was breaking these codes, he was engaged in a lot of psychotic behavior that interfered with his functioning. But despite the psychosis, he continued to work. He died a few years ago as a semi-retired professor at Princeton University, where over a very long period of time had a very distinguished career as a mathematician. If you do watch the movie, one of the things that I want to point out is that the hallucinations in the movie were not portrayed the way hallucinations are experienced by people with schizophrenia. The hallucinations that people with schizophrenia experience are auditory. They're voices. Now, the voices obviously aren't coming from anywhere, and you and I, if we heard voices and there was no one there, we would know that something was wrong. And people with schizophrenia don't seem to put two and two together and recognize that those voices are not real. Which means that if they had portrayed them as voices in the movie, you would have known immediately that that was a psychotic symptom. So what they did is they portrayed it as someone you could see, and he apparently could see, so that you didn't know whether they were real or not. That's one of the reasons why I recommend this movie, because you will watch the movie and realize, okay, yeah, he was psychotic, and then realize he was probably psychotic at other times, and I thought what was happening to him was real. One of the ways that psychosis is often described is it is a break from reality. You simply can't tell what's real and what's not. Let's talk about the symptoms of schizophrenia. We're going to divide them into categories, starting with positive symptoms. Now, to be clear, positive doesn't mean good here. When I say a positive symptom of schizophrenia, I'm talking about the presence of the symptom. The fact that it's there is the problem. It's what makes it a symptom. So delusions, for example, which are unreasonable beliefs, but also beliefs that would be considered unreasonable within your culture. So in our culture, believing in voodoo would be considered delusional because it's not a culturally approved belief. But in some cultures, it's readily accepted and therefore would not be delusional. Some delusions are frankly kind of off the wall crazy. They would be psychotic. All delusions are psychotic, but these would be very disorganized. But in some patients with schizophrenia, especially very bright patients like John Nash, they tend to form delusional systems that we call fixed. And those delusional systems somehow prevent the more dramatic deterioration that we find in individuals with schizophrenia. they somehow are able to organize the entire world around their delusional system and explain all the other feelings they might have with that fixed delusional system. Hallucinations. As I mentioned before, in schizophrenia, those are invariably auditory, and they're voices. The voices usually comment on what the person is doing. Sometimes they can be very critical. Sometimes they are command hallucinations, telling the person what to do. It isn't uncommon for individuals with schizophrenia to talk back to their voices as if they were real people, which is quite disturbing to the people around them who are not psychotic because, well, most people don't talk to imaginary voices. There are also attentional problems, especially in the early stages of schizophrenia. We're not very good at paying attention to more than one thing. So what we do is we focus our attention on something. For example, if you're listening to this right now, chances are if you stop for a moment and you focus your attention around, there's probably a lot of other noises that are going on and other things that were outside of your awareness because you focused your attention. People with schizophrenia, especially during the early stages, often have difficulty focusing their attention. So they are overwhelmed by stimuli and they simply can't process it. If you've ever had two people try to talk to you at the same time, you will realize that you can't process either of them. You have to be able to focus on one and tune out the other. The second class of symptoms are called negative symptoms. And again, that doesn't mean they're bad symptoms. Negative simply means that it is the absence of a normal response that is the symptom here. So, for example, a normal response is for us to carry on conversations and exchange information. But many people with schizophrenia show what we call poverty of speech. You ask them how they're doing and they say, good. And ask them what's happening and they say, nothing. They give one-word answers, often in a flat voice, and they never really expand on it. You can't carry on a conversation with them because of that. Another is called anhedonia, which is an inability to experience pleasure. So, for example, a nice hot shower feels good. A hug from someone you care about feels good. But for people with schizophrenia, many of them don't feel that good feeling associated. And unlike depression, where you don't experience pleasure, the anhedonia in schizophrenia tends to be stable. When you're depressed, you don't experience pleasure, but when the depression lifts, the things you found enjoyable are enjoyable again. Not true in schizophrenia. Avolition. That's an apathy where you don't want to do anything. In psychiatric hospitals, it's very common to have individuals with schizophrenia just sit there. They don't watch TV, they don't play games, they don't read books, they don't even seem to watch other people. They just sit there and do nothing. Other negative symptoms include flat or blunted affect. Now that shows up in several ways. One way that it shows up is with a very flat voice. Have you ever had an instructor who had a monotone, who always talked like this, almost like a computer, and didn't create the kind of feeling that is a part of normal speech? Normal speech is like music. It has a musicality. It goes up and down. And it has a rhythm that changes. And in fact, if you look at it very closely, that musicality and that rhythm essentially provides punctuation into speech so that you can see how the words are organized. If you skip punctuation in written words, it's very hard sometimes to figure out what's being said. The same is true here. individuals with schizophrenia often show this flat speech, and it's hard to listen to, and it's hard to follow. But they also show a flat facial expression. They almost look like a zombie. And it's hard to describe, but when you're talking with someone like that, it's very disconcerting. It's distressing because what they're saying doesn't show up on their face. Now, when we talk about things, what we're saying shows up on our face. Now, we don't have to tell our face, do that. Okay, I'm upset, so look upset. Or I'm happy, so look happy. It just happens. But it doesn't seem to happen in schizophrenia. Remember, Bleuler used the term schizophrenia because he said that there was a schism between thought and emotion. And what he was referring to is the lack of facial expressions. There's also an asociality. Now, you may remember that was part of schizoid personality. Schizoid personality were socially withdrawn because they had no interest in social activity. And that is a negative symptom of schizophrenia, not found in everyone with schizophrenia, but the more chronic the case, the more likely you will see this asociality. The final group of symptoms are called disorganized symptoms. They were at one time part of the positive symptoms, and they're highly correlated with positive symptoms, but they are also have their own distinct identity, so we now separate them out. So that includes things like erratic speech and emotion, and even motor behavior. We talk about thought disorder as being a central symptom of schizophrenia, but in fact, a better way of describing it is disorganized speech. I can't see your thoughts, and you can't see my thoughts. You assume that what I say is an indication of what I'm thinking. And so if my speech makes no sense to you, you assume that my thoughts are also disordered. Now, there are several examples of this disorganized speech. One is loose associations. Often that means that in a given sentence, an individual with schizophrenia will change topics 2 or 3 times so fast that you can't follow them. You sort of know that there's a link, but you just can't quite follow that link. Another example is to make up terms and not tell you what they mean. Those are called neologisms. And that makes it impossible for you to understand what they're saying. Now, Bleuler made up the term schizophrenia, but he defined it, and he became famous because he defined the term. But if you don't define it for people, they have no way of understanding you. Sometimes you'll get what are called clang associations. That's putting words together not because they have any meaning or belong together, but because they sound the same. So you might say, I like to sing, swing, bling, ping, ding. Okay, the first part, I like to swing, is fine, but all the others don't belong there. But somehow it felt to the patient like they belonged there because they sounded the same. Now, more often than not, it's rhyming, but sometimes it's alliteration where the same letter is being used. Sometimes the disorganized speech is so disorganized that we call it word salad. If you take a paragraph from a book and you type out each word on a single card, and you mix the cards up and put them together in a random way, the paragraph won't make any sense to you. It will seem random. It will seem like word salad. The idea of word salad comes from a tossed salad where you put a lot of ingredients together and then you mix them up so that they're random, so that every bowl from that tossed salad will have a little of all of the ingredients. The interesting thing about word salad is that The nouns and the verbs and the adjectives are where they're supposed to be. So it isn't random. But the meaning is completely lost because the words are not put together in a manner that conveys meaning. Now, we talked about flat affect. The disorganized version of that is inappropriate affect. We talked about the musicality of speech. In inappropriate affect, the speech may be musical, but it's a really bizarre music. So instead of saying that I do not think about that, which is very flat, they will have motion up and down, but it's not the way normal people talk. I don't know if I can think about that. Okay, so it's a musicality, but it doesn't work. Catatonia is a long period of immobility where the individual will maintain a posture, often a very uncomfortable posture like this. And they will maintain it sometimes for hours. Try doing it for 5 minutes to see how difficult that is. But not only do they do that, but if you come and you take their arm and you put it over here, they'll hold it there. That's called waxy flexibility. You see it in other conditions, but you tend to see it more in schizophrenia. Although, quite frankly, you rarely see it now because modern medications seem to prevent catatonic behavior.